Today, we'll be delving into the fascinating yet slightly disturbing facts about medieval sex and self-pleasure. Join us as we travel back in time to explore the unspoken history about intimacy and relationships in the medieval time. Contrary to popular belief, intercourse was not an avoided topic. It was considered a necessary part of marriage and procreation. However, it was highly regulated by the church and society. Despite the regulations the church had, women didn't just obey, as they had their own needs and urges. The medieval women were not afraid to voice their desires and make their intentions known. From writing love letters to ingesting love potions, they had some very creative ways to fill their desires. Now let's dive into the top 6 facts about medieval sex and self-pleasure. Number 1. Questionable self-pleasuring tools. Women in medieval times had very limited options for self-pleasure, but they still found creative ways to explore their sexuality. Some women used a plant called the Cantonese groin. It was a plant shaped appropriately to be used as an instrument for pleasure. When soaked in water, it would harden and then be used for penetration. Women in that day used all sorts of materials like stone, wood, ivory, tar, limestone, and even bones. Now for the weirdest material of all, bread. That's right. The innovation of women during that time included allowing a loaf of bread to harden, which they would use for penetration. In fact, you might be surprised to know that dildos were around back then. They were used for both sexual pleasure and medical reasons, such as treating hysteria in women. The church taught that pleasure should only be experienced in a marriage or for the purpose of procreation. Masturbation was believed to be a grave sin that went against the church and was often severely punished. The punishment varied depending on the social status and gender. Men tended to get minor punishments such as confessions and reparation. Women, on the other hand, faced more serious consequences, such as public humiliation and even imprisonment. Number 2. Love potions and herbal enhancers. Witchcraft was very common in medieval times, and if an individual was caught doing magic, they would almost always be burned at the stake. Despite this, many women practiced witchcraft and would create love potions with some very questionable and revolting ingredients. A love potion is said to be a magic mix of ingredients that causes the person who drinks it to fall in love with whomever offered it to them. Let's talk about the grossest ingredient that was used. One love potion was made from pubic hair, powdered bone, and menstrual blood. Others were made from worms, umbilical cords, fingernail clippings, animal blood, and even human skin. Women who were unable to attract a man often used these to seduce the man they desired. There were also herbal concoctions for enhancing self-pleasure, such as aphrodisiac herbs, which would increase sexual desire and pleasure. Herbal baths were a popular way women relaxed. They would add herbs like rose petals, lavender, and jasmine to the bath that had a seductive and arousing effect. They relied on many herbs and believed in magic in medieval times and used whatever they could to fulfill their desires. Number 3. The church's influence and rules about intercourse. The church had a strong influence on society and played a major role in regulating and controlling people's sexual activities. They believed that marriage was a sacred union between a man and a woman for the sole purpose of procreation. Any sexual activity that did not result in pregnancy was considered a sin. The church strictly forbade adultery and sex outside of marriage and considered them to be grave sins. The church also promoted celibacy for their clergy, with the belief that withholding from sexual activity would bring them closer to God. This also meant that priests were not allowed to marry or be involved in sexual acts of any kind. The church encouraged abstinence during certain times of the year, such as Lent or Advent. Intercourse was also prohibited on holy days, such as Saturdays, Sundays, and religious holidays. These days were supposed to be devoted to prayer and worship. The church even went as far as making missionary the only legal sex position, because other positions could confuse gender roles or enhance the pleasure. Anything outside of the church's guidelines was considered sins, which led to some harsh punishments. Some of these punishments include public humiliation, fines, imprisonment, or even execution. How severe the punishments were depended on the social status and gender of those involved. Number 4. Paying for pleasure. Prostitution in medieval times was a common practice, even though it was viewed as immoral and sinful by the church and society. To those outside of the church, it was considered to be a necessary evil, which in turn protected society from greater evils. Officials thought that if brothels weren't available to curb men's lust, they would turn to inappropriate outlets such as homosexuality or forcing themselves onto someone else. Documents showed that the church actually supported prostitution, with the belief that women of the night were responsible for guarding the honor and chastity of the nuns who prayed for the people. City officials allowed prostitution because they thought that by teaching young boys about the pleasures of flesh, they protected the honor of unmarried women. Now let's talk about brothels and what they looked like. Women who worked at brothels had to pay for board and food, and the owners of the brothel took 1/3 of the money the women made. The prostitutes kept the remaining money and any tips they'd gotten. The conditions in brothels were very poor, with cramped and unsanitary living quarters. The women were also at a high risk for catching diseases such as syphilis. Brothels were frequented by men of all social classes, from nobles to peasants. Sometimes the brothel would cater to certain groups, such as soldiers or clergy members. They say women were the sensual ones in medieval times, but we think a brothel owner of that time would beg to differ. Despite the popularity of prostitution, it was still seen as an immoral and sinful practice. The industry served many purposes, from allowing women to have an income to fulfilling men's desires. The main principle of it really hasn't changed much to this day. Number 5. Distraction from desire. During the medieval times, people would turn to religion to suppress sexual desires due to society's expectations. They tried to control themselves through prayer, fasting, and many other religious practices. Celibacy was a very popular practice for people who had problems controlling their sensual urges, specifically amongst religious orders like monks, nuns, and priests. Earlier we talked about herbal remedies that enhanced sexual desires. Now let's explore what herbs suppressed these desires. Mugwort was a popular option to suppress desire, and it also had a calming effect on the body and mind. Anise seeds had a numbing effect that helped to banish unwanted feelings. Finally, the most interesting ingredient of all, hops, the same ingredient as found in ale. Hops had a sedative effect that was thought to heavily suppress sexual feelings and desires. Some people would read erotic literature to satisfy their desires without sinning or being judged by society. Though many people did different things to suppress their feelings, some went to the extreme with chastity belts. Chastity belts were believed to prevent all sexual activity. They were worn on the waist and were commonly made from metal or leather. The belt would be locked with a key hidden somewhere else. Perhaps even the one wearing the belt wouldn't even know where the key was hidden. Number 6. Love and marriage. Marriage in medieval times was seen as a way to secure political alliances and to procreate, as opposed to love and companionship. The most common age women got married was at 16, and for men it was 20. The marriages were arranged by the parents based on monetary worth. The family of the girl who was to be married would give a donation such as property or money to the boy she would marry. Consummation of the marriage was necessary for it to be considered valid. This usually began with a priest blessing the bed, and then the newlyweds would prepare. It was common for family and friends to bring the couple to the bed to endorse the marriage. For wealthier couples, family and friends would stay in the room as the act was being done to be eyewitnesses to the marriage being consummated. Women were seen as their husband's property and had little say in their relationship in general. This led to the fact that consent didn't really exist in medieval times. Marital rape was not considered a crime, and women were expected to submit to their husband's desires at all times. Couples only had a few days a month where they were allowed to have sex. Men were always the dominant one, as it was believed women needed to be controlled by their husbands because of their lust. Remember that the missionary position was the only legal way to conduct intercourse as to the rules the church laid out. It was also believed when the man was in charge, it caused more level-headed sex. In general, marital intercourse was very strict and controlled by both the husband and the church. This may have been the reason why many women and men had affairs and illicit relationships despite the potential consequences. Thanks for watching another show of History's Weirdest. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Cheers!